Christine Gottlieb.
Please stay nearby.
Christine Gottlieb, co-director, NYU School of Law Family Defense Clinic. Kara Fink, practice professor of law, director of Interdisciplinary Child Advocacy Clinic, University of Pennsylvania. And Nadeem Bizar, partner, Klein Inspector, PC.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm going to ask that you would state your name for the record before you begin your testimony, but I'm also going to ask, because of the number, we have just an extraordinary number of people who want to testify today, and we only have until 1 o'clock. I'm going to ask that you not reach your testimony. I noticed that Ms. Gottlieb, yours was extensive, and we thank you for that, and we have a copy. If anyone would like a copy of the full testimony, you can obtain it from the table over here to my left, but we are asking that everyone stick to about 3 minutes per person. We're going to have a little timer, and we would hope that you will be able to get your testimony in so that we have the opportunity to hear from everyone today. Please state your name for the record and begin.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Christine Gottlieb. I teach at NYU Law School, Child Welfare Law and Policy, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I am not going to read. I do want to speak with you directly about this terribly important topic, and I want to say a couple of things. I can't do it justice. I would refer anyone who'd like to hear more to my written testimony, but I want to talk a little bit about the harms of current child welfare practices, and then I'd like to make 2 recommendations for ways that Philadelphia might think about addressing those harms and drawing from other jurisdictions around the country who are working on similar issues. Last spring, when at the borders, our country began separating immigrant families and taking children from their parents, whatever people's view on immigration policy was, there was not a single person who didn't understand that that was the harshest thing that you could do to a child. Mm-hmm. It's an intuitive understanding, it's a gut punch understanding that it is simply harmful to a child to take them from the security of their parents. And I want to highlight that one of the things that came out of that discussion was that every major medical and sociological association that studies parent-child relationships came out and made statements about the scientific evidence that shows that harm that we know in an intuitive way. And I just want to tell you some of the words that those organizations, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, used. Because they talk not only about the emotional harm, but about the physical attributes of the kind of trauma that children experience when they're taken from their parents. And they talked about racing hearts, a rush of cortisol, adrenaline flooding young bodies. The American Academy of Pediatrics said that separating children from their parents contradicts everything we stand for. It creates toxic stress that creates irreparable harm, disrupting a child's brain architecture and affecting his or her short-term and long-term health. And even short-term separations, the scientific evidence shows, do these things. And all of those effects are there when we take children from their parents because of child protective concerns. Now, some children do need to be taken. We all understand that. But we need to understand and make real that we only do it when it is absolutely necessary. And I think that although the law in Pennsylvania is that it requires clear necessity, as is the law in every jurisdiction. We use different words, but every jurisdiction requires that it only happen when it's absolutely necessary, and what we know around the country is that unfortunately it happens when it is not necessary. Philadelphia does have the unfortunate distinction of having the highest family separation rate in the country, and the way we can know that some of those separations are not necessary is that there is not a single piece of evidence that shows that a Philadelphian is more likely to abuse their child than any other person in the country. And that means there's a disconnect between what we intend to be doing and what we actually are doing. And I want to say that while the separation is the worst possible harm, the investigation itself can be harmful, it's invasive, it's intimidating, and it can be extremely stressful emotionally and physically, not only for the parents but for the children. And so we need to talk about the harm of the investigation as well. 2 recommendations for ways to think about solving these really tough problems that we face. And the first is that it requires a shift in professional culture at the Child Welfare Agency. It is not something that can be addressed through one policy, one statutory change. There are no quick fixes. It does take a commitment at every level, from the commissioner through middle management to the front lines. I need to tell you that Philadelphia is not going to be able to make the improvements I know it wants to unless that's a long-term sustained commitment. It is something that requires understanding that making a policy is not changing practice, that training is necessary, but it's not enough. There has to be accountability in addition to training. And it means that the decision makers, that's in the legislature and in the executive branch, need to listen to the parents who are most directly affected, because they are the ones with the most information about how their families, their children are being affected, and they need to be brought to the table. I know my time is...
We're over time, but your testimony is fantastic. I really do appreciate your testimony.
Could I have one very concrete
well, the thing
suggestion?
is, I really want to be fair to everyone. I really want to be fair. So if you could just wrap up in like 30 seconds or less, that I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. My very last point will be that one very quick, concrete step that is immediately available that we have seen bring down the number of children in foster care and the stress and harm of investigations is to change the legal representation that's provided to parents. And if in 2007, New York City began providing multidisciplinary, that's social worker, parent advocate, parent attorney working together, and it has brought down the number of children in foster care. I know there are some terrific attorneys in Philadelphia. The Bar Association calls on community legal services to train lawyers around the country, but they're not able to provide the kind of representation that's needed. And I would urge you, the federal government has just announced at the end of 2018 that they will match funding for this kind of high-quality parent representation, and I would urge Philadelphia to take advantage of that.
I think that, I always appreciate when we have folks who come and who testimony and who give testimony and who don't just, have their own comments, but have suggestions for this body. So I really do appreciate your suggestions and ideas, and I'm sure that that's something that we could follow up on. If we could have the next panelist state your name for the record and begin your testimony. We are going to be at 3 minutes. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Kara Fink, and I currently am a practice professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and I direct the Interdisciplinary Child Advocacy Clinic. I will attempt to stay within the 3 minutes time limit, although that is hard for a professor to do. I will try. I appreciate the opportunity so much to present testimony. I want to talk about my colleague Christine's testimony as well, because I actually was one of the people who started an interdisciplinary parent representation practice in New York City and the Bronx, which had a very high rate of removal similar to Philadelphia's. And I now have represented both parents and children in the Philadelphia child welfare and family court systems for the past 6 years. I have seen firsthand the critical role that preventive services, high-quality legal representation for parents and children, and interdisciplinary practice can play in safely reducing the number of children in foster care, providing services for families where out-of-home placement is required under the law, and promoting overall family stability, and more importantly, child well-being, a focus which we need to pay more attention to. As a note, my testimony reflects only my opinion and not that of the University of Pennsylvania. At the As managing attorney of the family defense practice at the Bronx Defenders, we represented thousands of parents accused of abuse or neglect in Bronx Family Court. As part of our legal practice, we worked with attorneys for children, judges, child welfare officials, and council members to safely reduce the number of children, and also to reduce the length of stay for children who had to be removed from their homes. What I want the committee to understand is that with Philadelphia having the highest rate of child removal, we need to move to a discussion that indicates that Philadelphia resorts to removal far more frequently than necessary to attempt to resolve the struggles facing parents and their children. When the interventions provided to parents and family are limited to removal or court supervision only, we lose sight of the inextricable and historic link between child welfare and the underlying poverty that the vast majority of families in the child welfare system struggle with every day. Initially, it may seem preferable to err on the side of caution, divesting caseworkers of their obligation to assess and identify whether a removal is warranted, and tasking family court with the review of every situation. However, this ignores the impact what we know from all of the medical and psychological research about even a short removal on a child's well-being, interrupting an appropriate attachment, their connection to their community, their school, and all of their external family relationships. It is clearly the best practice to pursue and invest in supportive services and resources that can be provided to vulnerable families. In Pennsylvania, most children do not enter the child welfare system for physical abuse. They enter because of neglect, which in my opinion, after almost 2 decades of practice, is a code for poverty and a lack of attention to systems for poverty. Across the state, 27% of children entered foster care because of the child's behavioral problems, representing a lack of adequate mental health services provided to families with children. 53% entered due to parental substance abuse, and 14%, a shocking number, entered because of inadequate housing, something which should never be the barrier to a child growing up in their birth family. These have identifiable services which can be provided, including housing assistance, mother-child drug treatment programs, and community-based mental health services. While many families may need of support, removing children from their parents causes significant trauma. Studies conducted by my colleagues at MIT show that children placed in foster care to comparably maltreated children who remained at home had worse outcomes, including a higher rate of involvement in the juvenile justice system and teen parenting. And as we've pointed out repeatedly, even a short removal is not a benign or neutral event in a child's life. Just to end, I would echo that there are currently a number of federal initiatives that the city and the state can look to improve the level of representation for parents and for children using interdisciplinary services to get at the root causes of neglect that brought parents and families into this system. We did it in New York, we can do it here in Philadelphia.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Bazar?
Bazar, yes.
Bazar?
Yes.
Yes. Please state your name for the record and begin your testimony.
Nadine Bazar, attorney at the firm of Klein and Spector. Chairwoman Bass, Councilman O, members of the committee. I am not here to speak on policy. There are several experts, two of which you just heard from, who spoke to policy issues surrounding removal from of a child from one's family's home. I'm here to speak to some of the harms that the children have suffered once they are removed from their homes. These are harms that they have not suffered in their biologic family homes or at the hands of their parents, but the harms that have been caused and have suffered because an overtaxed and overburdened system cannot sustain the number of children that have been removed. I'm an attorney here in Philadelphia at Klein and Spector. I've been a lawyer for 28 years. My practice focuses on the representation of infants, young children, adolescents, both boys and girls, who have been physically and sexually assaulted while in this system. Please let me make clear, these are assaults of these vulnerable members of society after they have been removed from their families' homes, after some inciting event has brought them to the attention of the Department of Human Services. I file lawsuits on behalf of these children, and I represent their interest in litigation against the parties that allowed these unspeakable assaults to happen upon children. Members of the committee, child abuse in the system, in the foster homes, in residential treatment facilities, and other youth facilities around the state is not a small issue. It has grown to be a common occurrence. It is an epidemic that continues to not only impact an individual, but to derail generations of our city's children and families. A child taken out of a home and harmed in a foster home will then be on a different course than a child that's typically left to their parents, where there's a loving, nurturing environment. I'm not here to offer testimony on the statistics about calls to DHS hotline or Childline, nor the intake process and how these reports are handled, although I believe greater transparency in how these calls are handled is necessary so that guidelines and perhaps uniformity can be created in processing these calls. I am here to offer, again, specific examples based on experiences, cases, actual children that I have represented over the years. All these examples demonstrate how an overburdened system creates room for errors and mistakes that result in unspeakable harms to the most vulnerable members of our society. That is, young children removed from their parents' or families' homes. Just briefly, MN is a child in 2013. A 7-year-old child was negligently placed in a foster home that was already under investigation for the foster father's inappropriate sexual advances towards another foster child. She was placed after there had already been a call to investigate. It should be noted that this home was actually approved as a foster home despite having a history of the foster parents' own children being involved with DHS, a weapons charge, a drug charge, and being closed by another agency. After the sexual assault of my client, and to be graphic, that is a middle-aged 50-year-old man who forced himself upon a 7-year-old child to perform oral sex. After the sexual assault of my client came to light, a safety plan was put in place that requested that the family be further educated in what constitutes appropriate discipline. That is absurd. Just briefly, I represented the teen victims of sexual assault by a staff member at the Wordsworth facility, and I understand that that facility has been at issue before this panel, or before this committee, I apologize. These assaults were allowed to occur even after other staff members observed and reported that the late 20s male staffer was inappropriately interacting with numerous female residents, all of which were emotionally vulnerable and had a past history of life experiences that made them more vulnerable to a sexual predator. And this staff member had access to those records. I won't speak to Ethan Akula, whose name has been in the news on an ongoing basis because I am sure the committee is familiar with that child. Another situation involves a 5-year-old who was sexually molested by another young boy who had been sexualized because of his own being molested. So what we're talking about is 2 young kids placed in a foster home together. The older boy was placed in the same home as this younger boy without advising the foster mother of the potential danger and a record that indicated that this child should not be placed with vulnerable children. Again, a matter of resources, a matter of communication, a matter of disclosures. Finally, DS involves a child who sustained a skull fracture after his mother, with mental health issues and limited parenting abilities, who had already had her rights terminated with 2 other children, jumped from a 2nd-story window with the child in her arms. Prior to her jumping, without proper notice, this family's file was closed by the Child Welfare Agency, despite all the risk factors that clearly presented as a danger to this child. The child spent the better part of the next several months recuperating in a hospital and is on his way to healing, but will never be the same. Unfortunately, I could go on for hours, and I understand I've even surpassed my 3 minutes, with the stories of these types of harms. The point I wish to make is a simple one. The system is overburdened. Given the tremendous number of investigations, mistakes will be made. These mistakes will result in poor supervision of the on-the-ground case managers who cannot fully do their jobs because of their caseloads, and an overburdened foster care system that will retain unqualified foster parents because the already qualified foster parents have no more space in their homes. There's no great mystery here. An overburdened system will break and mistakes will be made. These mistakes will result in the assault and injury of our most vulnerable population, children that have been separated from their families who need us the most. And these children are getting harmed at times more so when placed in the system than what they left behind in their loving homes.
I promise you this is the highly abridged edition.
Thank you.
My name is Richard Wexler. Chairwoman Bass, Councilman O, members of the committee. My name is Richard Wexler. I am Executive Director of the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. I have only one regret about being here. Too much of this testimony will be a rerun. The first time I testified before the Philadelphia City Council was 12 years ago. At that time, I pointed out that Philadelphia was an extreme outlier, tearing apart families at the highest rate among America's largest cities. Now, in the years since, there have been real improvements, but it's still true today. And I ask no one to take my word for this. The long written testimony includes hyperlinks to all of the data. I invite people to click on the links and check it out. The written statement's available at nccprblog.org. There's a link to it. Now, yes, there have been horror stories in those other cities that take away fewer children, but as we all know, Philadelphia has horror stories too. So all that additional suffering inflicted on all those children needlessly taken from everyone they know and love is doing nothing to make children safer. We are not alone in singling out Philadelphia's obscene rate of removal. Consultants hired by DHS itself raised it as well. In a recent story in the Inquirer, Commissioner Figueroa suggested that counties would be, quote, going rogue if they issued sensible guidelines for mandated reporters of alleged child abuse. Now, DHS has a lot of gifted, incredibly dedicated workers. I had the privilege of meeting with some of them when I was here 12 years ago, and they have incredibly difficult jobs. But as an agency, it is DHS that has gone rogue. It has been a rogue agency for decades, and it is time finally to bring it under control. It's important to understand that the typical cases that dominate the caseloads of child welfare workers are nothing like the horror stories. Far more common are cases in which family poverty is confused with neglect. Other cases fall between the extremes. So it's no wonder at least 5 separate studies, 2 of them massive in scope, found that children left in their own homes typically fare better even than comparably maltreated children placed in foster care. So please understand, a member of this council, whom I see is not here right now, said that this was about the personal grief of the families. No, it's not. It's about the personal grief of the children who suffer from needless investigation and needless removal. And all this trauma happens even when the foster home is a good one, and the majority are. But the rate of abuse in foster care is far higher than revealed by official statistics, which involve agencies like DHS investigating themselves. Again, I don't ask anyone to take my word for it. Multiple studies have found abuse in 1/4 to 1/3 of foster homes. The rate of abuse in group homes and institutions is even worse. And you know, it's interesting. When a case does come to light,
Yeah, I'm sorry, you have to wrap.
okay, what does DHS do? It rushes to court and gets a gag order so we won't know about it. But even that isn't the worst of it. The more that workers are overwhelmed with false allegations, trivial cases, and children who don't need to be in foster care, the less time they have to find children in real danger. So they make even more mistakes in all directions. And that's almost always the real reason for the horror stories. Don't let anyone tell you that family preservation and child safety are opposites that need to be balanced. That is the big lie of American child welfare. You can't have child safety without family preservation. The take the child and run approach makes all children less safe. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony.